dearest members of my family, valued friends and acquaintances, honorable colleagues, and last but not least, at an institution of higher learning, my fellow students. I sincerely hope that what I am doing here this afternoon will become a custom in the Faculty of Theology, the Dutch model, as it were. I have chosen to deliver this speech at this moment because this is the last week of classes, the last week of lectures in our faculty and for the academic year. It thus signifies a closure of formal academic activities. What is more important than timing this speech, however, is certainly content. Ever since I was a doctoral student in the faculty, and had my first opportunity to witness the passage from professor to professor emeritus, I've always hoped that the emeritus-to-be would share with us what he or she had learned over the span of their career. Most of my colleagues who have become professor emeritus have practiced their discipline for upwards of 30 years. And I've often wondered what changed during that course of time. Did they think the same things about their discipline at the end as they thought at the beginning? What insight might they have that could help me to gain a glimpse into the core of that discipline? Perhaps even in my more optimistic moments, could they give us the key to understanding what that discipline was actually all about? I might get into trouble here for creating an expectation that I might not be able to fulfill. But please be assured that I'm going to take a stab at it. For if I have learned nothing else in the 33 years that I have been talking to students about moral theology, it is that everything can be looked at from a different perspective than the one I am currently using. Neither I, nor you, nor those who put themselves up as authorities will ever have the last and definitive understanding of things. For we are all pilgrims on the way to truth. And we can only live and hope that someday, at some point, a visionary more astute than ourselves will someday just tap us on the shoulder and say, "You weren't too far off the mark." That said, let me begin at the beginning. I am a child of Vatican II, as my colleague Paul Scotsman has pointed out. On the day that the Second Vatican Council came to an end, the 8th of December 1965, I had just turned 20 years old. At that time, I was in a seminary, but it was not yet a seminary in the Vatican II spirit. The people who taught there had no clue that the church they were working for had just taken a different perspective than the one the seminary had represented. 2 years later, in 1967, I found myself living at the American College right here in Leuven and going to classes at the Catholic University of Louvain. At that time, a predominantly French-speaking institution, or at least in the classes that I was attending. 2 years that I spent at the American College and at this university significantly changed my life. For at the American College at that time, they did not allow me, but rather encouraged me to think, to ask questions, to be critical, to seek understanding. At the university, they did not allow me to passively accept answers to questions, but they encouraged me to consider different answers to the same question. The overwhelming impression was unanimous. Think, question, make the attempt to understand your faith. Fides quirens intellectum. I had discovered the meaning of theology first articulated by Anselm of Canterbury. Faith seeking understanding. Theology is a little more than that. I moved on from the seminary in 1969, largely because I was not at all convinced that the institutional priesthood was the place to find the answers to my questions. Returning to the United States, I ended up teaching religion at a local high school where I had the totally undeserved fortune to meet my future spouse, Marcella Sayers. Somewhat curiously, around the same time that happened, I also had the inspiration to return to Leuven in order to continue my studies in theology. Perhaps the main inspiration for that was the decision, was nothing more, no one less than the figure of Louis Janssens, the professor of moral theology in Leuven, who not only knew just about all the standard answers, but who also had the courage to keep asking questions. When we came, and I returned to Leuven in 1972 to resume my studies in theology at the new international English language section of the Facultät Godsgeleerdheid, I defended my dissertation in December 1977. In the following academic year, 78 to 79, about 13 years after the close of Vatican II, I became a gastdocent, a guest professor at this university. Unless I am mistaken, and I've tried checking with the same sources that our Vice Rector has checked, I believe that, and I think it's true, I was the first lay person to have been a full-time position teaching theology in this university since the institution of the faculty in 1432. If you want to count, that's 546 years. My dear friends, I'm telling you all these things not to aggrandize myself, but to situate you at the beginning of my career as a moral theologian. I've already mentioned that I was the child of Vatican II, although I did not really know what that meant at the time. And now I'm telling you that I was the first professor of moral theology at this university who was not a priest. I do not draw your attention to this because I have anything against priests, certainly not, but simply to observe that all of my older colleagues at the time had been educated and trained in the pre-Vatican II church. One of the primary tasks as priests was to hear confessions. One of their primary tasks as professors of moral theology was to teach their students how to hear confessions. It's difficult, or I have penciled in here this morning, unless you are a person about my age or older, it is difficult to explain to most people in 2011 what the Catholic Church was like before Vatican II. In some respect, I've given up trying. And I've reduced my description of pre-conciliar moral theology to 7 words. Bless me, Father, for I have sinned. This pretty much was what it was all about. What is sin? Usually a forbidden behavior. To what extent is a person guilty of sin? And under what conditions can a sin be forgiven? The textbooks that were used up until the time right after Vatican II concentrated on these issues. These books were so legalistic that the only significant change that occurred between the dawn of the modern textbook in 1850 and the demise of the genre around 1970 was the appearance of the new Code of Canon Law in 1917-18. It had become clear to many at the time of Vatican II that something needed to be done. There's little dispute that the Second Vatican Council was a watershed experience in the Roman Catholic Church in the 20th century. Not only the contours, but the details of Catholic theology had hardly changed for nearly 400 years. I hope you can see that. They're very small numbers. I'm sorry, but I needed to cover 500 years worth of history. My notes say explain the diagram. I'm going to tell you what, for those of you who may not be familiar with it, I want to talk about this thing called the post-Tridentine era. And so what is Trent? I'm sure many of you heard of the Council of Trent, but what is it? Well, it's the Catholic Church's response to the Reformation. When did the Reformation start? Most people put it at 1517. This is when Luther posted his famous 95 Theses, challenging the authority and many of the doctrines of the Roman Catholic Church. The response to that was the Council of Trent, 1545 to 1563. It was a long period of time. Don't believe everything everyone tells you about the Council of Trent. It was the most dynamic, the most reforming, the most forward-looking council, including Vatican II, that the Roman Catholic Church had ever held. This was its response to Luther. This was the beginning of what's called the Counter-Reformation. But the Counter-Reformation didn't come to an end at the Council of Trent. The Counter-Reformation went on because the Reformation, or the Counter-Reformation went on because the Reformation was more than just dogma. It was more than just religion. It was about land. It was about politics. It was about power. It was about who was Catholic and who wasn't Catholic. And so there were wars that were started with respect to what happened in the Reformation, and they weren't settled until 1648 at the Peace of Westphalia, when we finally said, good, the Catholics are here, the Protestants are there, and we're separated. This is the period we can refer to as the Counter-Reformation. Part of that Counter-Reformation, or I should say this goes on until the beginning of the Second Vatican Council in 1962. What happens here, and why the Counter-Reformation is so long, because you must remember that in the 16th, 17th century, there's no internet, there's no faxes, there's no even quick, speedy mail. It took time for things to happen. The Council of Trent decided that all priests would be educated in the same way, in a seminary. They had to build the seminaries. They had to construct the curricula. They had to write the textbooks. And this took quite some time. And so we can count the post-Tridentine world from the end of the Council in Trent until the beginning of the Second Vatican Council. And it's precisely here in which I have described virtually nothing changed. The models and the methods set up in the post-Tridentine Counter-Reformation period, roughly 1545, 1648, were still in place right up to the pontificate of John XXIII, who prophetically called for the church to renew and rejuvenate itself in the contemporary world by calling for a council. Moral theology was no different from any other discipline in the post-Tridentine era. Once it was put in place as part of the standard seminary curriculum at the beginning of the 17th century, it remained basically the same for 350 years. Moral theology was a study of human behavior. It determined what constituted a sin and attempted to elaborate a framework for judging accountability or guilt of the person who committed it. And how did moral theology determine what constituted a sin? By holding human behavior up to a standard, a norm, a rule, a law. At first, that sounds easy. And Jews and Christians seem to have a very handy tool at hand to do this, namely, the Ten Commandments. At least that's the way the Christians saw it. Because if you were Jewish, and I mean really Jewish, it wasn't so simple. For the devout Jew had no less than 613 commandments to follow. 365 negative ones telling him what not to do, and 248 positive ones telling her what has to be done. After Christians had done away with just about all of the Jewish peculiarities like getting circumcised and avoiding pork, they faced the immediate problem of creating their own list of do's and don'ts. For there may have been a commandment forbidding adultery or killing, but what about fornication? What about living together without being married? What about serving in the military or lending money for interest? There were so many questions that needed to be answered. The problem was conveniently solved by St. Paul. He discovered that some of his Greek friends had a whole list of things that seemed to fit right into the lifestyle to which he and his fellow Christians were aspiring. They were the Stoics. And they based their morality on what they called reason. Now, I know I said Greeks, and I've shown you a picture of a Roman, namely Marcus Aurelius. Marcus Aurelius was an emperor as well as a Stoic. And what better way to create a system based upon laws than to look towards someone with absolute authority, especially one living a stone's throw from what would eventually be the papal residence. These people thought they had it all figured out. They thought what the world was supposed to be like, even though experience showed them that it didn't always seem to work out that way. Paul thought there was a reasonable method for discovering what God the Creator wanted us to do. Use your reason. So it came to be called natural law, something based on reason and the presumption of a rational order. It became part of the Christian tradition. And make no mistake, these are not simply old ideas belonging in the ancient world. The ideas of Stoicism are not very far from our own times. Now, all this looks relatively simple and even helpful. And let's be honest, this is the way that most of us think about morality. It is called normative morality because it is based on norms or standards for human behavior, or in simple terms, what is right and what is wrong. So far, so good. But doesn't this also beg the question precisely what is right or wrong? Well, again, there seems to be a simple answer. It is an act that is right or wrong. I imagine that you're all beginning to wonder, what do they pay this guy for? Everything he's doing is so simple, I could probably do it myself. So let's make it just a little bit more complicated. Suppose I ask you precisely what kind of act we are looking at here. Is it a physical or material act? As in, I take a book home? Or is it something perhaps a bit more specific? Something with an extra circumstance thrown in, such as, I take your book home. At this point, I've provided you with only one circumstance. The book is yours. But there can be all sorts of circumstances as well. Do you know that I am taking your book home? Or do you not know? Do you want me to take your book home? Or maybe not. Is it a red book or a blue book? Is it a book that is important to you? Or is it a book that you told me you wanted to get rid of? Some of these circumstances may be important. Others, as you see, may be trivial. Perhaps we should wait until we have all the relevant circumstances collected before we can make a judgment about whether or not taking your book home with me was right or wrong. So even then, but even then, we could ask a further question about the incident, namely, are all these things together sufficient for determining a human act? So let's move on from here, from what looks like a relatively simple normative morality, to try and understand the meaning of the human act. We find this core idea about a physical or material activity. Okay? You see? Or perhaps, to show you that we really do earn our keep around here, it could be an omission as well. Before long, however, clever moral theologians, wishing to make even more work for themselves, came up with this brilliant idea that we probably have to look at circumstances. The circumstances of what took place or didn't take place. So now we're not talking just about an act, we're talking about a behavior. It's a little more complex. Things begin to get a bit more complex here, and pretty soon the priest confessors begin to realize that for someone to engage in a sinful behavior, they need to have adequate knowledge about exactly what is going on. And not only do they need to understand what's happening, they need a mechanism to sort out all the details. So now we're looking at a process of deliberation, going on about the details of this behavior. Eventually it dawns upon some of the moral theologians that even though what we are looking at is sinful, the person doing it has to be free in order to be responsible or held accountable. So now we have to factor in free will. And as if that isn't enough, you have to ask yourself, even if this person was acting with freedom, did they really have a choice in the matter? Were there any viable alternatives? Now, I know that this is beginning to look somewhat unmanageable. That's why they have professors do it. But I'm afraid that it isn't over yet. For there is one more important element that some moral theologians, at least, thought was just as important as all the others. And this addressed the question, to what extent was the person committed to what they were doing? Or did they really want this to happen? The technical word for that is intention. And so here we have it, a model for what we could like to call the whole moral, the whole human act. Would you believe me if I told you that Thomas Aquinas had worked all this out back in the 13th century? He did not invent it, of course. He borrowed most of it from Aristotle. He also probably borrowed a little bit from Peter Abelard, the guy who insisted that intention was really the core issue. But no one would listen to Abelard, because Bernard of Clairvaux had tried to convince everyone that Abelard was not orthodox, much like we see in our own church today. Yes, this is what Thomas Aquinas taught his students, but it was not long before the Counter-Reformation. Now you see why this is important. And by extension, throughout the entire post-Tridentine period, Catholic moral theologians began hacking away at the model. As far as they were concerned, sins were sins. And it didn't matter what your intention was or whether you had any options. You could always just do nothing. So let's just get rid of all this distracting stuff, like intention and choices and deliberation, and stick to the bare bones of what happened. And as a matter of fact, we probably don't even need to spend very much time on circumstances, because we all know talking about circumstances is really just an excuse for saying you didn't commit sin when you really did. Circumstances sounds like situation ethics. So let's get rid of those two and get right down to it, right down to the core. A sin is what you do or about what you should have done but didn't. And this is how we arrived at the idea that some acts can be considered or classified as indifferent, good, or evil, all by themselves. You don't need to think about deliberation or circumstances, or even for that matter about free will. Some acts are simply evil all by themselves, and we call them intrinsically evil. This, in short, was the picture of moral theology up until the time of the Second Vatican Council. But is this truly what we can call a human act? It concentrated upon sins, upon material behaviors, and we had all sorts of norms to tell us which of these behaviors were right and which ones were wrong, especially in the field of sexual ethics. Many people suspected at the time that things needed to change. The Council had called for a moral theology with more scripture in it, more reference to the teaching and the life of Jesus Christ. But in order to do that, we had to get away from the law-oriented and the act-oriented morality that we had developed for the confessional. Some of the more insightful moral theologians at the time, people like Bernard Herring, Joseph Hookes, Franz Backel, Bruno Schuller, Richard McCormick, and yes, of course, Louis Janssens, realized that what we needed to do was not to change the rules. What we needed to do was to change the way that we think and talk about the subject. We needed to change our whole approach. Or if you're an academic like myself, you call it something else. You say we need to change our method. These leaders in post-Vatican II moral theology thus embarked upon an experiment of thinking differently and moving beyond individual behaviors. It was not long before they realized that many other thinkers before them had already done this. But the discipline of Catholic moral theology had not listened to them because they had little to say about individual behaviors classified as sins. Rather, they talked about attitudes, about circumstances, about situations, about conflict and compromise. This was no longer simply about sin or about moralizing about behaviors. It was about how do we figure out morality? And that is precisely doing ethics. What they were talking about was not morality. It was about ethics. It was not about what was sinful. It was about how one could be a better person and about how to live one's life. Many of the post-Vatican II moral theologians were attracted to this way of thinking, and they began the process of incorporating it into their work. But you do not transform a 1,000-year-old institution overnight. I can remember being somewhat amused and at the same time puzzled the first time I picked up a book called The New Morality. This New Morality book, looking at it and seeing that the first chapter was about the Old Testament, and then the next chapter was about the New Testament, followed by an exposition of the fathers and doctors of the church, then trying to reconstruct the work of ancient philosophers, and of course the theologian who became everyone's favorite, Thomas Aquinas. I imagine a lot of other people began to wonder, what's going on here? Were these guys trying to reinvent the wheel? If this has all been said before, what's this reform about? What's this new moral theology going to be about? To be perfectly honest, I could not see it then. But then I think most people also could not see what was happening. Our method was truly becoming ethical. Theologians were no longer asking what you did. They were trying to get you to ask yourself who you are. It was no longer about what we may or may not do, but about what we are capable of doing. Janssens in particular saw that Aquinas was not telling us that we have to keep the laws, but he was reminding us that the moral life was about our ultimate end and how to get there. And what was that? In full attendance to the scriptures themselves, it is the kingdom of God. And it is not that all these things on the left-hand side of my diagram here were forgotten or left out. It's just that they were considered to be inadequate. In retrospect, this was all pretty heady stuff. It was exciting, it was liberating, it was challenging. And then disaster struck. On the 25th of July, 1968, Paul VI issued his encyclical on regulation of fertility called Humanae Vitae. After condemning an abortion and sterilization in paragraph 14, Paul VI wrote, "Similarly excluded is every action which either in the anticipation of the conjugal act or in its accomplishment or in the development of its natural consequences proposes whether as an end or as a means to render procreation impossible." And the judgment passed upon any such action was that it would be intrinsically dishonest, intrinsese inhonestum, a technical term for immoral in itself. Here we were back to a morality of behavior. All the ethical questions that had surfaced after Vatican II questions about how morality works, about the criteria for making assessments and judgments, about how to deal with complexity and conflict in real life. All these questions ceased being asked, and moral theologians turned their attention to authority. Did Pope Paul VI have sufficient grounds for making such a statement? Traditional moral theologians sprang to the defense of the Pope, and the battle was engaged. The ban on contraception, as it came to be known, was traditional. Contraception had always been condemned by the Church, and to say now that it may be permissible would be equivalent to admitting a mistake. Humanae Vitae made the claim that sex and procreation always had to be linked. But those who disagreed suggested that the two did not always have to be linked. But if this were the case, then what arguments could be brought forth to condemn masturbation, premarital sex, even homosexual acts for that matter? The truth of the matter was, and still is, maintain the condemnation on contraceptive act and keep sex and procreation linked absolutely, or see the whole of sexual morality fall apart like a house of cards. The tragedy of Humanae Vitae, or the Humanae Vitae event as I like to call it, was not only that it pretty much destroyed the credibility of the Catholic Church in the area of sexual morality, but it also severely damaged the fledgling movement of theological ethics to achieve the revision called for in Vatican II. Now there was a revival started to restate the reasoning of the old textbooks of moral theology, to name and condemn sins, and to demonstrate the immorality of acts that are intrinsically evil. They wanted to remind people, as Pope Paul VI had done in his encyclical, that one may never do an evil so that good may come about. Or to put it in another way, the end does not justify the means. At this point, ladies and gentlemen, I would venture a guess that some of you are saying to yourselves, what's this guy talking about? This person calling himself a Roman Catholic theologian. It's clear that he's disagreeing with the Pope, but is he trying to get us to accept the idea that the end justifies the means? Before I respond to those thoughts, let me invite you to think of one small but extremely important thing. Humanae Vitae and the approach of the people who defend it is nothing more than pure normative morality. It is built upon the notion that you can morally condemn physical and material acts without ever asking who did it, why they did it, what were the consequences of doing it, and just as important, what would be the consequences of not doing it. For 25 years, the so-called revisionist theologians tried to provide an alternative for the moralizing of the handbooks and create new approaches that people could understand. But the institution held on. And in 1993, Pope John Paul II published his encyclical on morality, calling it Veritatis Splendor, the splendor of truth. It's funny, we've already heard these things 2 times before. In the mind of John Paul, morality was a simple affair. All you had to do was to know and follow the commandments. And those who think otherwise are wrong and not doing proper Roman Catholic moral theology. This was the institution's attempt to reinstate traditional moral theology that is about normative ethics. It's about laws and rules, about reward and punishment. It's about naming sins and accusing yourself of committing them. In great contrast to this, we had seen the beginnings of theological ethics. This approach to morality was not about laws and sins and confession and punishment. It's not about approving or condemning acts in themselves for being intrinsically evil. It's about seeking to understand the meaning of being and living ethically. At the same time, it is not something that Roman Catholics can do on their own by issuing an encyclical, as if the rest of the world had no ethics, no values, no insights into the meaning of morality. The discipline of ethics had to be done in dialogue with anyone who was interested in seeking the meaning of a good, responsible, ethical life. It's just like when St. Paul discovered the Stoics. When we discover someone who is doing ethics well, we should ask our theology and our theologians whether we can live up to that challenge. Theological ethics has not abandoned normative ethics. It has simply recognized its inadequacy. Veritatis Splendor told us some truth, but unfortunately it only told us half the story. It told us about intrinsic evil and about sin, but it didn't say a single word about intention, about why people might do the things that they do. It never uttered a single word about conflict, about choosing a lesser evil, or for that matter, building an ethics built on virtue. Theological ethics is not frightened of cliches like, do no evil that good may come of it, or the end justifies the means. And if you're still uncomfortable with those phrases, let me leave you with a simple example. Does anyone here recognize these two gentlemen? The year is 1967. The man on the left, his name is Thomas Sarzel. No? Okay. The man on the right, his name is Christian Barnard. Ooh, I see signs of recognition here. Who are these people, huh? Let me tell you. Sarzel performed the first successful liver transplant, and Barnard performed the first successful heart transplant, both in 1967. Both of these, of course, were from deceased donors. The first successful transplant from part of a liver from a living donor was performed by Christian Brosch in 1989. I put that in smaller print because it's a whole story that I'm not ready to go into, and I'm sure you're waiting for this to be done. Actually, it's a very, very interesting story from an ethical point of view. Suppose I told you that I'm going to take a knife and cut you open. I'm going to slice through muscle and tissue, and there will be a good deal of lost blood. You will be exposed to infection. I'm going to remove one of your perfectly functioning organs. Then I'm going to sew you back up. And unfortunately for you, you will be in pain for weeks after this all takes place. That probably doesn't seem so nice, does it? Let's face it, there's nothing nice about it. Just think of the urban legends about people waking up in a foreign country in a bathtub filled with ice, with a little note of apology says, sorry, but we took your kidney from you. And forget the urban legends. Think about the number of desperate people in third world countries who sell their organs just to be able to survive. So why don't we call this intrinsic evil? Look at the picture. This is not the picture of the man receiving or the woman receiving an organ. This is a person losing it. John Paul II and Pope Benedict XVI call this an act of charity. To have your body sliced open and one of your organs removed. This they can live with. But if you introduce a hormone substitute to stop ovulation, or you use a condom to make sure that your partner will not be infected with a disease, or you use any form of birth control so that you can responsibly determine the size of your family, you are considered a sinner. Tell me, what is wrong with this picture? If my mental picture is not enough, please take another look at the picture I have up on the screen and imagine yourself being cut open and one of your organs removed. Ladies and gentlemen, if the end does not justify this means, what does? So here is the situation that I leave you with, and here I am addressing my younger colleagues who still have to sort this out. If theological ethics is ever going to regain credibility in the church, and the church is going to regain credibility in its ethical teaching. The discipline that you inherit has a split personality. Traditionally, moral theology was, and in the minds of some still is, sin-oriented and act-oriented. It is occupied with the determination of right and wrong behavior. Once you can determine whether a sin has been committed, you know all you need to know, and that is it, the end of the story. It is a system that is closed in on itself. All of this is typical of sexual ethics in the official teaching of the Church, which most people, lay as well as professional, consider to be dysfunctional. After Vatican II, what I am referring to as theological ethics began to become realistic and began to deal with real people in a real world. Rather than being preoccupied with behaviors and sins, it addressed the issues of forming good intentions to accomplish goals that are beneficial not just for oneself, but for others as well. Eventually, the practitioners of theological ethics rediscovered the importance of virtue. By simply being virtuous, but simply being virtuous is not enough. For it is still important to find a way to make these things happen. So far from ignoring the insights of analyzing human behavior, theological ethics needs to engage in determining what is right and wrong. The difference is that in this scheme, right and wrong are determined not all on their own or in function of some kind of law or norm, but right and wrong are determined on the basis of whether they help us reach virtuous goals. This is typical of a good deal of the social ethics in our tradition. That is, even in the official teaching of the Roman Catholic Church. This, you see, is what we all really need to think about. We need to think about how we think about things. To really understand ethics and to talk about it intelligently, we need to perform a Copernican revolution of the mind and stop thinking just about acts and behaviors and to begin to think about who we are and where we are going. This is Christian ethics. Hopefully, someday it will also be Roman Catholic ethics. If you got any questions about this or you would like more clarification, you're welcome to join my class on Friday morning at 11 o'clock, where I'll be discussing these things with master's level students. We're also doing a little something about how you apply this to sexual ethics. For those of you who might like to know a little bit more about the project of rebuilding theological ethics, I invite you to visit the website. Thank you for your attention. Thank you for your support. Marcy, Jason, Mika. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you very much, Joe. It's always a joy to listen to the sharp analysis of a well-trained scholar in moral theology. It's time for an intermezzo. The choir will sing for us two lyrics. When you were a turn and Margie.